As we move to study language, we'll find the topic of language unpacks into a lot of different areas. Um, and one thing that we'll be asking is the difference between the activity known as speech and the abstraction known as language. Together, these speech and language encompass a huge array of phenomena, and they've made possible the creation of the human world, as it were. Um, so, as we begin to find out how scientists go about their business here, we must realize that any science of language can only choose to look at a limited number of aspects of everything that falls under this heading at once. So the science of language is always partial, and what we mean by language is always somewhat a little bit uncertain. Now, we're going to be mostly concerned with work done after the Second World War, and that's the point after which the computational metaphor arises, talk of information processing arises, and theories of language become thoroughly mixed up with theories of mind. But there's at least two other periods that are important to know about that precede this. First of all, before the 20th century, there's a whole bunch of scholarly work on language. Scholarly work on language has been around as long as there's been written language, pretty much. And the term used for the scholarly work on language that's appropriate for most work done before 1900 would be philology, which means love of the word, if you like. And around about 1900, then we get the first real extension of scientific expertise into this area. The end of the 19th century has seen an awful lot of changes, the development of such well-defined fields as biology and chemistry, and we've even seen the emergence of psychology. And so along with this, scientific methods for the study of language are introduced, and they give rise to a new way of looking at language, which is called structural linguistics. And that will be largely replaced by the kind of linguistics we're most interested in, generative linguistics, after about 1950. But we'll just have a little look at the earlier ones, because generative linguistics, which we're concerned with, is of its time. It's particular to the second half of the 20th century and ongoing. And it's chosen one way to view language. It's a very abstract way of viewing language. And the manner in which it approaches language, for example, ignores the distinction between speech and writing. It considers language as an abstract system that underlies both speech and writing. Now, that's not the only way one could come at language, as we'll see. But this abstraction is what has got mixed up with theories of mind, and we'll be looking at those in later videos. But before 1900, there was a lot of reason to study written language particularly. There was much less work done on spoken language. A lot of the scholarly work has been inspired by religious texts, scripture, the interpretation of scripture, commenting on scripture, fighting over scripture, arguing, translating religious texts. This has been a hive of industry for hundreds and hundreds of years. Foreign travel wasn't as common before 1900 as it is today. So the kind of languages that people tended to learn were usually Latin and Greek. The idea that you would just pick up Italian or Croatian or something is rather more recent and comes with the ability to travel easily. But in teaching people Latin and Greek, notions of grammar evolved, which become changed when we reach generative linguistics. And there's always been an interest in studying the texts of highly valued authors, people like Homer, for example, the epic poems of Homer or Shakespeare. Now, none of these activities are particularly scientific, but they're all very important. There's nothing wrong with them, and they are areas of intense scholarly activity. And this philology still goes on today. But then, at the start of the 20th century, when scientific methods started to be applied, we get the birth of what we now call structural linguistics. principal character here is a guy called Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss gentleman. And he developed a way of looking at first of all, the sounds of language, and then the other pieces that are built of sounds, like syllables and words, and then sentences. And what he did was he managed to construct a systematic view of how things like sounds are organized within a language. And this is very much characteristic of the kind of science that was done around 1900. There was an awful lot of observations made. Science always starts with observation, or it should. But these observations need to be interpreted, and one way to do that is to recognize patterns in them. So to give you an example of the flavor of this work, here are two very important scientific figures. At the bottom right, you see the periodic table of the elements, nothing to do with language whatsoever. This emerged in chemistry at around the same time, about the 1870s. And what it provided for the first time was a way of organizing all that was known about the different elements and their properties into a single systematic form of organization so that you could see the links between these two. The periodic table was an invention. Came to a guy called Mendeleev in his dream. But it proved to be a remarkable way of organizing, ultimately, the whole domain of chemistry, because it made clear that there were relationships between the elements that were not arbitrary. And so organizing them into this table practically allowed chemistry to proceed on its way. At the top left, you see a similar kind of graph. I want you to see that they're very similar. They're both two-dimensional tables in which things are organized. What are organized here are consonantal sounds. Speech sounds can be roughly divided into vowels and consonants. And this shows the consonants of hopefully all the world's languages organized into a table. Now, this table is not organized as the chemical elements are, because sounds are different. The rows here pick out consonants that are made in different manners. So some consonants are made by closing off the airstream and then opening it up, as when I go pa, pa. There's a closure and then an opening. So those are the plosives in the top row. Some consonants are made by closing the oral airways and opening a valve at the back to allow air out through the nose, like m and n. Some consonants are made by making air flow through your mouth and then producing a small constriction that makes a turbulence, so you get hissing, like s, f, f. Those are the so-called fricatives. So the rows distinguish between these different ways of making consonants. And the columns differentiate between where the constriction is, because there's usually a constriction involved, from the front of the mouth, which is the lips, all the way back at various stages through the teeth, just behind the teeth, the roof of the mouth, the back of the mouth, and then all the way down to the throat. So these are organized. The columns pick out different places of articulation, and the rows pick out different forms of articulation. So you can see this is a way of organizing these, and so the elements in this table become understandable within the structure, which is a series of oppositions. We're not going to delve into it in detail, but this emerged in the late 19th century and it has been updated many times since, but is still in use today. It's called the International Phonetic Alphabet. So structuralism was going to be overtaken by generative linguistics and greatly influenced generative linguistics. But as a way of thinking about the human and social sciences, it proved to be very important beyond linguistics. The idea that you could take a human abstract ability like language and you could treat it much like you might treat the domain of chemical elements. You could systematize it, and you could recognize structures and patterns in it. This went on to be very influential in other disciplines like anthropology and social sciences, in psychoanalysis, and of course in linguistics. So structuralism wasn't a waste. It paves the ground for what will emerge as modern linguistics or generative linguistics in the second half of the 20th century. And it represents a big leap forward in taking scientific methods into the domain of human culture and human social aspects. So that's all we say to those, and we'll move on to generative linguistics next.